does. It makes some of these guys stumble. It really does.
Oh,
I
yeah. I
fuck
mean,
with
you
them a
can
lot.
see it on the signage. Check this out. Up at the old 1West school, when you watch the old video, behind Ahrayah, there's a couple posters or whatever. One of them is the Lord's Prayer in Lashawan Qadash. There are massive grammatical errors in the prayer that is behind his head
Right.
every time he's
I've
speaking.
seen.
And it's whoever did it, and the fact that he's sitting there teaching with it shows that no one at the school knew Hebrew, because they would
No,
never have
they
that
didn't.
Lashawan Qadash prayer
No,
with
just
those.
basic
With
pure Hebrew.
it's
They don't know it.
Yeah,
They don't know it.
these are rudimentary errors that they're just co-signing.
Greetings. In the clip you just saw, Vocab Malone was talking with a family member of Ahrayah, and they were talking about how the Lashawan Qadash version of the Lord's Prayer, which was on the wall at the original school at 1West, how that poster, that chart revealed things about how well the teachers and leaders of 1West understood Hebrew. So in this video, I'd like to discuss that in a bit more detail. However, as a bit of background, let me first note that more than a decade ago, GMS, or a Great Millstone, started sharing a Lashawan Qadash version of the Lord's Prayer online. And when I first saw it, I was initially unsure if the version that they were sharing actually went back to 1West. And the reason why was because since the 90s, another former member of 1West, a man known as Yawanathan Yasharahla, had a different version of the Lord's Prayer online, right? And so initially I was uncertain which one of these versions went back to 1West. And what immediately stood out for me in the version which was put out by GMS was how it attempted to render the English phrase, hallowed be thy name, as Qadash Haya Shamka, right? Meanwhile, Yawanathan's version had a more sensible Yit Qadash Mecha, right? Admittedly, as per his Lashawan Qadash pronunciation, he probably would have pronounced it Yatha Qadash Shamka or something like that. But if we put pronunciation aside, at least the string of characters gives us something more sensible, right? But anyway, as I was saying, I was unsure which of these two versions went back to 1West, went back to the school from which both GMS and Yawanathan descended. Well, as Vocab alluded to in the clip that you just saw at the start of this video, there's now publicly available footage of Ahrayah teaching at 1West, and in that footage, one can see the version of the Lord's Prayer that 1West used, and then they used this before the splits. You can see the version of the Lord's Prayer that they used prominently displayed on the wall in the school. And when one looks closely at it, it is indeed the same version that GMS brought out more than a decade ago. And for those who aren't familiar with the Phoenician or so-called Paleo-Hebrew script, I'll also transcribe it into the now standard Hebrew characters, or the square or Ashuri script. And as you look at this, notice that it has the phrase Qadash Haya Shamka, right? And in this video, I'm going to discuss that in a bit of detail. Now, of course, that's not the only curious feature of this version of the Lord's Prayer, right? Honestly, this video might be too long if I went through every detail, but there are lots of other things that can be commented on. Like, for a quick example, another favorite of mine is this portion where they pronounce, ka-wa. Now, what is that? Some might not be sure initially, right? But I'm confident that what happened was they took a standard Hebrew translation of the Lord's Prayer, and then they made changes to it to try to make it their own, right? And I bet that the Hebrew translation that they had in this place the word ken, which is to say kaf nun, specifically kaf nun sofit. But when they saw ken, they mistook the nun sofit for a wa, and then they incorporated that into their version of the prayer, right? They saw kaf nun, but because it was a nun sofit, it looked like a wa to them, so they put in kaf wa, and that's how you get ka wa. And while this is perhaps minor, it might also be worth noting this portion here, which they pronounce Nathan Lanawa. And that's their attempt to say, give us, give to us. The Nathan part, nun tau nun, is the root of the verb laten, which means to give. And while that verb does have a nun as its first root letter, that first nun drops off when the verb is rendered in the imperative. Like, for example, in Genesis 14:21, when the king of Sodom says to Abraham, ten li, give to me. So the initial nun in that spelling is superfluous. It's not a proper rendering of the verb. Another interesting detail is the way that the definite article just stands by itself, like the way the definite article does in English, right? And also notice the awkwardness of them putting it before the tetragrammaton, essentially, before a proper name. And honestly, I'd say that much of the text reveals that the person who put this sign together was thinking in English, right? That's the theme overall here. But like I said, in this video, it would be quite long if I just went over every detail on every line. So for now, I want to focus on specifically that line, Qadash Haya Shamka, right? And perhaps it's worth noting that Chaarab, known as Chaarab, who's a man who's touted by some 1West's as the closest thing to an expert in Lashawan Qadash, that gentleman, Chaarab, who, by the way, is also a man who used to teach Lashawan Qadash back at 1West. So that gentleman, Chaarab, he likewise recites the Lord's Prayer with that phrase, Qadash Haya Shamka.
That word that we speaking in Hebrew, Lashawan Qadash, that's the language that the Most High spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with, man. And if you don't feel them words within you when you say them prayers, like even Abanawa Shabbat Shamayim, Qadash Haya Shamka, you got to feel the power.
In fact, Chaarab, or Chaarab as they always say, but Chaarab has said that they were already using that prayer when he himself first visited the school back in the 80s.
When I first came into the school, man, Tahar and Shah were teaching. When the brother said Abanawa Shabbat Shamayim Qadash Haya Shamka prayer, Abanawa Tapalala, I felt the Spirit of the Most High come into the place. I knew I was in the right place. And I knew I at last found the truth. Yes.
So, with all that before us, what is Qadash Haya Shamka, and why am I focusing on it? Well, it stands out for me personally because I think it's a glaring example of a proponent of Lashawan Qadash thinking in English and then trying to plug Semitic terms into that, English matrix, right? I think you can pretty much reverse engineer what happened, and to do so, you first have to note that the person who came up with this phrase was trying to produce a Hebrew equivalent to the King James Bible's rendering, hallowed be thy name. You see, they saw Yit Qadash in their already existing Hebrew translation, which they were using as a base, and they couldn't make sense of it because they weren't really familiar with the different verb stems. And, they didn't see the point, especially since such verb stems don't really exist in English. The English doesn't have an equivalent of the Hit-Pa'el stem. And then, on top of that, Yit Qadash is just one word, but their English text, which was serving as their inspiration, had two words, right? The English text says hallowed be. Those are two words. Hallowed is one word and be is the second word. And so I think that they looked at that and they figured hallowed simply means holy. So they thought, okay, Qadash. And then for be, they looked up the verb to be and they just throw in the root for that, Haya. And that's how they arrive at Qadash Haya. Right? And for me, this is an example that really captures the reality of Lashawan Qadash in practice. You see, when you encounter proponents of Lashawan Qadash, you'll often find them telling someone that the standard forms of Hebrew aren't actually Hebrew, and then they'll declare that they have the true Hebrew, right? They know the ancient Hebrew. And then, in something akin to a shell game, what they actually do is they take something from a standard form of Hebrew, and then they change it a little bit, after which they present that slightly altered form as the true Hebrew, right? Now, you'll usually see that sort of game among the rank-and-file proponents of Lashawan Qadash, but what the 1West version of the Lord's Prayer shows is that this trend goes all the way to the top, right? The leadership of 1West was playing the same game. And moreover, as Vocab alluded to, it seems that no one at the top objected to this curiosity or to this, to this version of the prayer that has a number of curiosities. And I think that reveals that no one in the school really knew much Hebrew, not even the leadership, right? But whatever the case, a proponent of Lashawan Qadash might feel tempted to indignantly object that they don't see any reason why one should be leaning towards Yit Qadash, or they might say Yatha Qadash, or however that stupid nonsensical word is pronounced, right? In fact, some might think to themselves that that's probably just Yiddish. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the relevant biblical text, right? We'll begin with the Greek text of Matthew 6:9. Now, some might object that they don't care about the Greek text, but the reality is that the King James Version of the verse was translated from the Greek text. So when 1West tried to produce their version of the Lord's Prayer, they were essentially putting forth a meta-translation, which is to say a translation of a translation, insofar that it was like a Lashawan Qadash translation of an English translation of a Greek text, right? And anyway, here we are in the Gospel of Matthew, the 6th chapter, and we will look at the 9th verse. And the relevant word is agiasteto. Now, it's not two words. It's just one verb, right? And it's rendered in the passive. It's a verb meaning to sanctify or consecrate. And let's keep that in mind, that Greek term, as it's going to come up again in a moment. And with that, let's now turn to a Hebrew translation of the New Testament. And here I'm going to be using what I suspect was the Hebrew translation that they had at 1West's, that being the translation of Franz Delitzsch. And now we turn to Matthew, the 6th chapter, and at verse 9, we find Abino Shebeshamayim Yitkadash Mecha, right? But I want to focus specifically on Yitkadash, right? And while that's a modern Hebrew translation that we're looking at, perhaps it's worth noting that the medieval Shem Tov Hebrew translation of the Gospel of Matthew, you see, this is the manuscript of the Shem Tov Hebrew translation, which is at the Vatican Library, and you'll notice that it too uses Yitkadash in that same place. Now, of course, I'm not saying that you have to defer to either Franz Delitzsch's translation or the Shem Tov translation, right? But this does raise a question. Why did they both use Yitkadash there? Why did these medieval translations and modern translations, why did they all use Yitkadash? Well, with that question in mind, let's now turn to the Hebrew text of the Torah. And I'll be using Rudolf Kittel's Biblia Hebraica, and I want to look at Exodus 19:22. Okay, bear with me for a moment as I turn to Exodus 19:22. Here we are in Exodus, it's called Shemot in Hebrew, the 19th chapter, and we're going to look at the 22nd verse, and I want to focus on the word Yitkadashu. Now, this is the same verb that we just saw in those Hebrew translations of Matthew, the only difference being that here, it's rendered in the third person plural, while in the translations of Matthew we looked at, it was rendered in the third person singular. But they're both the same verb, both rendered in the imperfect, and both are in the hit pa'el stem. So having seen that, let's now look that verse up in the Septuagint. And again, the verse we're looking at is Exodus 19:22, keep that in mind. And we're now going to see how that verse, or more specifically the verb we focused on, how that verb got rendered in the ancient Greek translation of the text. So here we are in Exodus, there's the Greek rendering of the name, and we're in chapter 19, and we're going down to verse 22, which is right here. Now note the verb, agiastetosan. Unfortunately, it runs onto the next line, but nonetheless, the verb here is agiastetosan. And much like the verb it's translating, it's in the third person plural. Now, this is the same verb that appears in the Greek text of Matthew 6:9, which was agiasteto, the only difference being that the verb in Matthew is in the third person singular, while this verb is in the third person plural. So with all that before us, let's now think about this, right? In the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of Exodus 19:22 uses agiastetosan to render the Hebrew verb yitkadashu. So then, if the New Testament at Matthew 6:9 uses the singular equivalent, agiasteto, it would make sense that a Hebrew rendering of that would use the singular counterpart to yitkadashu, which is yitkadash, which is precisely what we find in both the medieval and modern Hebrew translations of Matthew. Now, at this point, some proponent of Lashawan Qadash might want to object that they don't care what the Septuagint has to say either, right? They don't care about the medieval Hebrew translations, they don't care about the modern Hebrew translations, and they don't care about the Septuagint, right? Even though that would be a bit silly at this point, let's nonetheless entertain that possibility by offering a bit more, right? You see, and with that in mind, I'd like to now turn to the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible. So here we are in Matthew chapter 6, and here is verse 9, where we find Abun de Bishmaya Neᶜetaqim Shmach, right? Neᶜetaqim is the exact Syriac equivalent of the Hebrew Yitkadash. It's from the same root. They're both rendered in the third person singular imperfect, and it's from the Syriac verb stem, which corresponds to the Hebrew hitpa'el verb stem, which is what Yitkadash falls in. And I actually covered this in my video on the Ge'ez and Syriac translations of Matthew 6:9, which I'll link to in the video description. You see, we have ancient translations of Matthew into other Semitic languages, those being the ancient translations into Ge'ez and Syriac. And both those translations use their respective languages equivalent of the Hebrew Yitkadash, right? The Ge'ez text has Yitkadas, and the Syriac text has Netkadash. Both of those fall within the respective languages equivalent of the hitpa'el verb stem. And proponents of Lashawan Qadash might not understand the idea of Hebrew having different, verb stems, but the phenomenon is found across the spectrum of Semitic languages. So let's now review and summarize what we've covered here so far. First, the Septuagint renders yitkadashu as agiastetosan, so it makes sense that when Matthew uses the singular form of the latter, agiasteto, a Hebrew rendering of Matthew would employ the singular form of the former, yitkadash. Second, the ancient Ge'ez and Syriac translations of Matthew likewise use their respective languages equivalents of yitkadash, those being yitkadash in the Ge'ez text and netkadash in the Syriac text. These three terms are from the same Semitic root, and all are third-person singular imperfect renderings within each language's equivalent of the Hit-Pa'al verb stem. And when you put this all together, the case for using Yit Kadash in the Hebrew version of the Lord's Prayer is overwhelming, right? 1West didn't use that verb because they were thinking in English and because the Hit-Pa'al verb stem is foreign to their thinking, right? It's alien to their thinking. But on that note, I'll close this first installment on the Lashawan Qadash version of the Lord's Prayer here. I'll also have a second installment, which will look at the good Dr. Kelly Richardson's adaptations of the 1West version of the Lord's Prayer. That'll be in a subsequent video. As for this video, I welcome any comments, questions, or criticisms. I don't censor anyone here, so feel free to share your thoughts, whether positive or negative. And as always, God bless.